Everybody, welcome to Nigel Hicks's December 2020 photography talk. This month we're talking about landscape photography. And well, obviously landscape photography is quite a large subject. And so in a 45-minute talk, we're not going to be able to cover absolutely everything that there is to say, not surprisingly. So it'd be an introduction to the subject of landscape photography, and then later on in future talks in the coming months, we'll probably delve into a few specific areas of landscape photography and sort of look at more specialist areas. But tonight will be a sort of a general introduction to, well, the way I see landscape photography and the way I go about it, and sort of introduce a few areas and a few techniques which we can then look at in more detail in the coming months. So, as you can see with this shot, it's quite a landscape photography. I tend, as much as I possibly can, aim for very simple compositions. I don't want too much clutter, too much detail, just want a nice, strong, single strong subject which dominates the frame and which really gives me a nice sense of atmosphere and mood, and which really transmits, I hope, to somebody looking at the pictures some idea of the beauty of the place or the ugliness of the place, whichever, and which, as I say, puts over some mood and atmosphere. And there's a variety of ways of doing that, of course. One of the most common ways is to shoot in what is often called the golden hour. A lot of people think of the golden hour as being the first and last hour of the day. I would modify that slightly in saying the first and last hour of the day, either side of sunrise and sunset. So basically from an hour before sunrise until an hour after sunset. So you've basically got 4 hours of great atmospheric photography to do you can cover in a day. Obviously that's a wide generalization, but that's the sort of thing that you can aim at in terms of having nice low warm sunlight, nice and atmospheric, giving you an atmospheric setting. The number of times I actually see photographers pack up their camera gear the moment the sun has dropped below the horizon is quite incredible. But really, very often the best light show comes 20 minutes or even 40 minutes or sometimes even more than that after the sun has set. And this is like the kind of situation we have here. This is taking quite some time after sunset. And the sun under the horizon, below the horizon, is just lighting up clouds high up in the sky. And so this is sort of post sunset, looking at the dusk sort of lighting. So don't put your camera away the moment the sun goes below the horizon. Hang in there and be patient. It can take a while, but then you often, if you've got nice light anyway, that is, of course, get rewarded by a really nice light show. Now, in terms of, apart from the golden hour, other things about landscape photography, it can be a generic view such as this one. It could be this could be almost anywhere, really. It's actually photographed in Lithuania, but it could easily be anywhere in the temperate region or even some tropical areas with conifer trees. Or it could be a famous view, and famous views could be great to photograph, but actually it can be a nightmare because then the fame of the place dominates rather than actually just the beauty of your landscape photography. And then it can be a very abstract view. This one is sort of partially abstract, or it can be quite a literal representation of the view that's in front of you, or the landscape that's in front of you. So abstract or literal, generic or famous. And then, but one thing which unites most, well, not just landscape photography, but photography all around, really, is generally shooting with your subject off center in some way. So you hear about the law of unequal thirds. So you can divide your image frame up into sort of thirds, unequal thirds, with your main subject sitting at the intersection of the 3 thirds. A little bit difficult to pinpoint that idea exactly in this shot, but nevertheless, I think you'll see that the subject is off center. You can either see that the subject as being the trees, but actually I would think of the subject as being the cloud in the sky here, and that's what really catches the attention. So anyway, most landscape photography is done in what you might call, say, the golden hour, the very beginning of the day or the very end of the day when the sun is low or even below the horizon. But I'm immediately going to contradict myself and say, but not always, because sometimes if you're shooting in the tropics, then a really high tropical sun can be quite effective as well. And you can have very high sun working as long as you've got a very clear visibility And as you can see a long way, if it's hazy conditions, then you really have everything can be a bit yucky and a bit washed out. But if you've got strong light and or clear visibility, then you can have strong light, strong saturated colors. And in this particular picture, apart from being very strong tropical colors, compositionally, we have this sandbar going off onto one side of the picture, going around in a nice curve. And I deliberately got one person over here on the side here. This is actually to indicate that landscape photography doesn't necessarily have to exclude people. It can include people, but they generally have to be pretty small in the picture. If you start having people coming in close to the camera, then it becomes a people shot, because humans are programmed, if you just can't help it, to actually look at people when they're there. So if you want to include people in a landscape shot, it's best to keep them quite small, so that your focus remains on the landscape, and the person there is just to give perhaps a sense of scale, or perhaps in some senses a bit of a pivot for the landscape to pivot around that particular person. Here, for example, this person here sitting in the water. I have this feeling, maybe you don't, but I have this feeling if you were to draw a line from her towards just in front of the camera, and another line from her towards the end of the sandbar, then this whole sandbar would rotate, because of its curve, would rotate and pivot around her. So although photographically the main subject is the sandbar, the whole thing tends to pivots just around this person. Perhaps that's me just seeing things, but that's the way my mind works on this kind of landscape photography. Moving on to a famous view now. Obviously, there aren't many views in southwest of England that are more famous than this. St Michael's Mount, taken just before sunset. One point about this picture, of course, is that your landscape photography doesn't have to be all natural views. It can also include man-made structures as well as small people. So you include them in the landscape view, and again, perhaps not completely dominating the picture. You want to have landscape there, or in the case seascape, but have them as an important photographic element. Have the buildings there as an important photographic element. So this is not so much a picture about St Michael's Mount, but it's really about the seascape that surrounds it, and also, of course, the causeway leading to it. And this is all quite deliberate. Taken just before sunset, as I say, the sun is very low, coming in from the right-hand side of the picture. And then we have the composition of the causeway taken with a wide-angle lens, so we've got quite strong diagonals there with the causeway leading the eye from the front of the picture into the scene, and pointing like an arrow towards St Michael's Mount. So your eye starts off at these cobbles in the foreground, and then comes to comes to rest on St Michael's Mount, but actually is led into the scene towards St Michael's Mount. And one of the beauties about the really low sun here, of course, is the fact that coming in on the side, they've really picked out the shape of the cobbles. So you've really got the feeling of texture of these cobbles. And although there's quite a bit of cloud floating around and the sea is rippled by a little bit of breeze, the overall feeling also is a little quite calm. It's quite a calm, peaceful picture with nice golden light, which is giving us sort of really nice, warm feeling. The other thing about this picture, of course, also, as with the previous shot, the tropical shot, it's a wide-angle view with a narrow lens aperture. I believe it's shot at f20, f22. So what we have is what's called a big depth of field. That is, a large part of the picture is sharp, and in this one you can see it's sharp all the way from right in front of us with these pebbles, all the way to St Michael's Mount in the distance. So we have a big depth of field to this picture, and that's quite a common thing in landscape photography, especially if you're shooting with a wide-angle lens. You will want to have as much of the picture sharp as you can possibly get, so all the way from right in front of you all the way to the horizon, more or less. And that's done with using a wide-angle lens and with using a narrow lens aperture, so you get a big depth of field. However, sometimes, not all landscape photography is done with a wide-angle lens. Sometimes you will use a telephoto and come in, really home in right in on this surf. This is a sort of 300mm lens using quite a fast shutter speed, 400mm. Again, with quite strong angular sunlight coming in from the right, really lighting up this area of surf here. And a lot of people who go photographing with me will know that I will usually when I'm photographing water, I will usually put the camera on a tripod and use a really slow shutter speed, so I will blur any moving water, and you'll see plenty of that in tonight's display. But people do ask me about, well, why don't you also use a fast shutter speed and freeze the movement of the water so you get these droplets in midair? And my usual reply is that yes, that you could do that if you can get you've got enough light to have a fast shutter speed, and also if you're using a telephoto lens to really home in on that water that's flying through the air. This kind of picture only works if you're using a telephoto lens and coming in really close in on the water, so you really show the boiling turmoil going on here. If you were to shoot this with a wide angle lens, you would actually, the waves would actually look quite small and the spray would look very distant and it would lack any kind of impact. And in that situation, if I was shooting wide angle, I probably would then put the camera on a tripod and just use a slow shutter speed. But if you want to have really dramatic, energy-filled, agitated shot of spray and the waves crashing over rocks, then you would use very fast shutter speed, of course, to catch those droplets, but also a telephoto lens to really home in on those water droplets and the foam coming in around the rocks. This was taken at Batalac in West Cornwall, just in the early evening. But as I say, if you're going to pull back a little bit and also shoot in calmer weather where you've got much smaller waves, then I would generally put the camera on a tripod and use a pretty slow shutter speed. So this one taken of surf crashing over rocks at Sandymouth near Bude, right exactly as the sun is sitting below the horizon. I find it's very atmospheric and very moody and very dynamic. If I were to shoot this with a fast shutter speed, if I could get a fast enough shutter speed, then the waves would come out looking pretty small and rather inconspicuous. And so would the spray, I think, coming up over that rock. Because I've used a slow shutter speed, then we've really got it's really blurred the movement of those waves. So we've really got the sense of movement there, and with the water coming over the wave at the same time, I think we've really got a sense of dynamism and movement. And these two foreground rocks, to some extent, they're intended to catch the attention and lead you into the view. But actually, I think this big rock here with the spray coming on over it is so strong that your eye tends to go straight to it anyway. So they're a little bit superfluous, but to add an extra little bit of interest. Now, the other thing about this picture, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit over the next few minutes, is the fact, of course, that if you're photographing straight into the sun like this, even where the sun is setting, the sky is going to be an awful lot brighter than the water. The water is going to be comparatively dark compared to the sky. Now, the human eye is great at seeing wide contrasts like this, the sky really bright, the water quite dark. The sky can handle that contrast range, no problem at all. But the camera, as a digital sensor, can't handle that contrast range, and what you'd end up with is a picture where the sky would be way too bright and the sea would be far too dark, and the picture would be really unbalanced. So what you use is what's called a neutral density graduated filter, mercifully shortened to ND-grads, in which you have a sort of a rectangular filter where half is dark and half is completely clear, and you put the dark half of the filter over the brighter part of the view, which in this image, of course, is the sky. That will darken the sky and will tend to lighten the water as well. So you basically decrease the contrast range in order to actually get a view which the sensor can handle. If I just move on, I'll show you. If I can get it to work, there we go. Show you what I mean by this. This is two pictures I've put together, one with and one without an ND-grad filter. The top picture is without the ND-grad filter, and this is something that you would typically see in a landscape picture where you've not used an ND-grad filter. The grass is very dark, the water's even darker, and the bright sky is really quite burned out. It's very pale. You can't really see the cloud pattern all that well. Doesn't really look like the view that you saw when you were there with your eyes. Come to the bottom shot, and we're use an ND-grad filter, a neutral density graduated filter, to darken the sky, and it's had the impact of not only darkening the sky but also lightening the land and the water, and it really shows up the cloud pattern much better. So this is a situation, or an instance, I should say, where you've really managed to overcome this problem of too big a contrast range between the sky and the land for the digital sensor to be able to handle. And you've really brought the contrast range, or the dynamic range as it's often called, down to something much closer to what the sensor can handle. And you end up with a picture that looks much closer to what you were actually seeing yourself when you were there. You do sometimes hear people boasting that they never use filters because it's cheating. Well, that kind of misunderstands the use of filters, certainly the use of ND grad filters anyway, because here, as you can see, the ND grad filter is a very important element in actually overcoming a shortcoming in behavior of a digital sensor and actually correcting a problem that we have there. So if we move on, we'll show you what these ND grad filters look like. This is the kit that you would use. Firstly, top right is this ring. It's a ring with a thread on it, and this you screw onto the front of your lens. And so you have to have a ring that has the same thread as the front of your lens. So if you've only got the one lens, then you only need one ring. If you've got several lenses, if you're very lucky, you'll have all your lenses will have the same thread. But usually you'll find that you've got lenses with several different threads. So you'll have to have a ring for each different thread size you have in your lenses. So you screw this ring onto the front of your lens. If you've got any other filters there already, such as a UV filter or a polarizer, you must take that off. Otherwise, that will cause shading in the corners of your eventual picture. So take your UV filter off first, and then screw this ring on. You will then clip on or slide on onto the rim of this ring, the holder, the filter holder, which looks like this or something like this. And then you would slide into the holder one of your filter. And you see here we've got two different types of ND grad filter. Top left, we've got one which is called a hard ND grad, which is a sharp dividing line between the dark area and the clear area. And at the bottom right, we've got a soft ND grad, which gives you a gradual transition from dark to clear. Now, the hard ND grad you would use when you've got a definite horizon. So, for example, the sea up against the sky, or hillside or hilltop up against the sky. Or in the soft ND grad, you would use perhaps in a situation where you're not quite sure where the transition from dark to light area is. Perhaps say if you're in a forest where the forest floor is very dark and the canopy overhead is very bright, but you can't really see exactly where the transition occurs. So you would use a soft ND grad filter. So if I then move on and show you the whole lot assembled on the front of a camera, this is what it looks like. I should say that actually you can also get ND grad filters that are circular, which will screw onto the front of your lens. And I would say absolutely don't use those, because although you can rotate the filter to get the transition line between the dark and the clear in different angles, you can't actually raise or lower that line. The only way to raise or lower it is to change the angle of the camera. So then you're radically changing the composition of your picture. Always use this system of rectangular filters sliding into this holder, because you can slide the filter up and down to get that transition zone of your filter lining up as perfectly as you possibly can with the horizon on the scene as you're looking through the camera's viewfinder. It does take a bit of practice. When you first start it, you absolutely just can't see where that transition zone is at all. So you will have a few disasters and a few mistakes. But as you practice more, you actually get better and better at it. In terms of number of filters, it varies. The number of slots you have on these holders does vary depending on the manufacturer, but usually there's at least 2 slots. I would always say don't use more than 2 filters at a time, because obviously they are plastic, and so they will degrade the quality of your picture a little bit at a time. So the more plastic you have in front of your lens, the more degradation of the picture you're risking getting. Also, being plastic, they do get scratched, and they do get marked, and they do get dirty. And the more you have there, then the more danger you have of having interference to your picture. So don't use too many filters on the front. So no more than, I would generally recommend no more than 2. Oh, other people might say otherwise, I don't really know. Anyway, so now I'm going to just show you a few pictures that I've taken with ND grad filters, and you'll see that most of these are actually taken into the light. That's quite a common thing for me with photography. A lot of people, when they first take up photography, will shoot with the sun behind them, so shining straight onto your subject, which is great. It's a simple angle to manage, and you end up with nice record shots, but it's not a particularly creative angle of lighting. You end up, say, with good records, but not with anything particularly dramatic. To get really dramatic, creative, atmospheric, moody shots, you often have to shoot with the sun either on your side or actually shooting into the light, so your subject is backlit or even silhouetted. it's harder to pull off those photographs successfully. You can get an awful lot of disasters and mistakes, but when it does work, then you can get some very dramatic shots. So this one is a sunset, obviously taken on the River Exe, using an ND grad filter, which I've slid down all the way to the water line. So I've darkened the hills as well, just so as to lighten the water. And we've got a very tranquil scene. Obviously, the main subject photographically is this boat in the foreground, which catches the eye. That's the hook for the eye coming into the picture, and then it leads you into the scene towards the sunset. Move on to something much more dramatic, go from what is actually quite a tranquil scene into something that is really agitated and animated, in a scene where the sun is really very, very bright. In the last shot, the sun was actually being filtered to some extent by water vapor or dust in the air, so it's not quite so strong. Here, the sky is still, that the air is very, very clear. There's nothing much in the air to actually weaken the strength of the sun, even though it's getting quite close to the horizon. So it's really bright. The contrast between the sky and the water is immense. And although I've used 2 ND grad filters on this, it's still, the contrast range is still too much to handle. The headland here is very dark silhouette, which works quite well for the rocks and the cliffs out at the end here. But over on the right, we've got really too big a dark patch. But it's over in the middle part of the picture, and with the surf catching the light here, it's so dramatic. I think it tends to lead your attention away from that, and that doesn't distract or detract too much from the composition. Your attention mainly is focused on the surf here and on the drama of these clouds with the sun shining straight towards you, coming in from behind those clouds. A less dramatic kind of picture, but one that is quite strong nevertheless. Again, photograph is 2 ND grad filters, actually, quite a bright sunset, but one which has really darkened the clouds that are there. And actually, this is an example of where you've actually used I've used an ND grad filter to enhance the drama of the clouds, to actually make it look stormier than it actually was. And it's really given some very strong atmosphere and mood to the picture. The one problem you might see here, of course, is that I've lined up the ND grad filter, the transition zone, with the horizon. But then, of course, we come into this hill area here, and you see the hill here is very dark because it does actually have a little bit of the dark area of the filter over it, which I actually don't mind. I think it works quite well because we have this area of sunlit cliff here, which is being lit by the setting sun, and this area in the background here, the hill, just sort of drops away into the background. It sort of looks like it's falling away in the shadow of this cloud. So it's I think it's quite a dramatic scene. And then compositionally, we have this great big V, which actually leads out towards the sea and then takes the eye towards the setting sun. But then we also have these diagonals up here in the clouds. And with the help of the ND grad filters, it's given us a very dramatic cloud pattern. Moving inland, but still staying with the theme of water, up on Dartmoor, photographing desolate moorland is actually really a difficult thing to do. And the last thing you want to do is actually photograph just the desolate moorland. You need a photographic subject in your foreground, a good hook to catch the eye and lead the eye of the viewer into the scene. And in this instance, I've used this marshy pool, which is really quite a strong element in the foreground. You could use things like a wind-gnarled hawthorn tree, and I've got plenty of those shots, or you could use a standing stone or something, or a ruined building, anything like that. But using an ND grad filter as well here, I've actually helped increase the drama of the shot by darkening these clouds to actually make them really stand out, make them very dramatic. And the whole thing looks as though it's kind of moving from left to right. The wind is going from left to right. The sunshine is shining from the left. And the clouds, these squally clouds are moving across from left to right as well. So there's a whole sense of movement in the picture from left to right, and just this showing off overall the desolation of the moorland, but with this big photographic hook in the foreground of this marshy pool. Now, all the shots I've shown you so far really have involved at least a certain amount of sunlight, and that usually, with a lot of landscape photography, is the case. There is sunlight coming in somewhere, but there are times when you would shoot in quite flat lighting, and this is one situation there. Here, where actually a grey sky does work, and I've used an ND grad filter to darken the sky and actually make pick up cloud patterns that actually weren't visible to the human eye. The sky, although it was cloudy, was quite bright, and so this pattern here in the sky was not visible to the eye, but it's really been picked out by the ND grad filter to actually add an extra element of drama to a picture that was otherwise falling a bit flat because of the lack of light. Compositionally, it's a little bit cluttered because you've got blocks of ice all over the place, but we do have this strong diagonal block of ice in the foreground here, which is really hopefully catching your eye and leading you into the scene towards the sea, to this area of ice in the background and then to the sky. This is melting glacial ice that is taken on the shoreline on the south coast of Iceland, where a glacial ice that has sort of been washed down through the lagoon and then out of a river mouth and into the sea, and then has been brought back onto the beach by the waves. And then something else which, taken on a very cloudy day, sort of a semi-stormy day, but I've used an ND grad filter on the top of the picture to darken the clouds, and I've used a slow shutter speed, about 1/4 of a second, I believe it is, yeah, 1/4 of a second, to actually blur the waves and really give you these strong waves crashing over the rocks. So I've exaggerated the drama to actually give you the real sense of a stormy day, on a day that was sort of moderately stormy, but not that bad, but actually using the ND grad filters really heighten the drama of the clouds, and using the slow shutter speed has really heightened the drama of the water crashing in over these rocks. And this sort of group of rocks is where your eye, I think, probably comes to rest, along as well as this pattern of water here, and then you go out towards the sea and the cloud pattern beyond. So that's kind of how you would use an ND grad filter, especially as I've shown you a lot, with a lot of sky present, and also if you say you've got a distinct horizon, and in this case shooting with a lot of water. Now I'm going to move inland actually and go into forest. So very different subject matter. It seems like quite a strong, sharp transition, but the linking element is flat lighting. That last shot, the last 2 shots have been photographed in very flat light. And when photographing inside a forest, I always recommend that flat lighting is the best thing to use there as well. If you've got bright sunlight, then you have bright highlights and deep shadows all the place that really break up the pattern, and you really literally can't see the wood for the trees because of all the lighting. Here, even though it's very flat lighting, we still have quite a dark area here. We have some bright areas on the leaves of these rattan palms, which are growing around the base of these big buttress root trees. This is in some lowland rainforests in the Philippines. And just gives you an idea of just how flat the light was. Exposure for this picture was 10 seconds, so it really was quite dark in there. And then after shut down to f/22, it's true, so that I'm getting a big depth of field. So everything is sharp as much as is possible. But that's a slightly chaotic scene, but that's always the way in woodland. It's very hard to actually get really good compositions when you're in dense forest or dense woodland. And very often you're doing this kind of thing, just picking out little vignettes, little cameos, which will tell you a bit about the forest and about the scene. And that's what I've done here, just homing in on the base of this one tree with a secondary subject in the background there. And then also with these beautiful bright green ferns growing in all around to actually really capture the sense of the dense tangled forest. Close to home, in order to actually get compositions in the woodland, you may want to try to step back to actually get a bit of space. And there you can often use a river flowing through the woods to actually give you that space. And then can help you get a picture of the forest. In this particular shot, of course, it's really, the shot really is actually more about the river than the forest itself. But then nevertheless, it is setting the scene of the forest taken at the end of May. So that the woodland is really just recently leafed out, so it's bright green. And then the river, well, the river is just taken after some heavy rain, so it's in full spate. And then we have these rocks in the foreground here as a catch or hook for the eye to lead you into the shots, and then the water takes you off down into the scene, and towards the trees. This area on the left here is possibly a little bit cluttered, but what it actually does is it helps to frame the scene, and so that your attention is held within the frame. Without those there, then the water would carry your eye out beyond the left-hand edge of the picture, which I really wouldn't want. Having the slot here helps actually keep your eye concentrated within the frame and in with this area of the woodland and the stream. And then coming on to, as I've been saying so far, the sort of in photographing woodland, you want to have flat light, but I'm going to contradict myself again. And occasionally you will have situations where you will be able to photograph in sunlight. And the frequent situation for me is when the sun is pretty low early in the day or late in the day, and you get to shoot into the sunlight. So you've got the shadows of the trees coming up towards you, the trees are backlit, got the light coming through the leaves, and here we have what's called a little starburst. So the sun is partially hidden behind branch of the tree, but just enough of it pokes out from behind it to actually get this burst of light. And if you're using a narrow lens aperture, like f16 or f22, then this will give you that light bursting out as a really lovely star. Now I've used an ND-grad filter here to darken the top half of the picture because it really is very bright up there. And the forest floor, we got all these wonderful bluebells, was quite dark, certainly in the final pictures. Again, my eye could handle the contrast range very easily. But in the pictures that were coming out without the ND-grad filter, these bluebell areas were pretty dark and the trees were much too bright. So you use an ND-grad filter to darken this woodland and in so doing lighten the bluebell, so the picture, the whole scene is much more evenly balanced. Going to go back to tropical rainforests briefly again. This is a situation where I was forced to photograph in sunlight. Sometimes when you're a long way from home, you don't have the option to wait for the right kind of light. For this particular bit of rainforest, I really had only about half an afternoon in which to get some pictures, so I had to go with the sun that was delivered. So here you can see the problem of bright highlights and deep shadows creeping into the picture. I've managed to moderate it to some extent by having the sun right behind the fronds of this palm, again with a little bit of a starburst coming out. I've used a gradual ND or soft ND grad filter to actually lift the light on the undergrowth here and darken the top part of the picture a little bit. I've kind of given up worrying about the sky burning out, but just managed to help concentrate on trying to moderate the contrast range created by the sun shining through all this vegetation. And I ended up with a picture which actually, I think, for me anyway, tells quite an interesting story about tropical rainforests, certainly as it is in the Philippines anyway. But on the other end of the scale, you have this kind of tropical rainforest. This is high in the mountains, drenched in thick fog. So if you turn the camera looking up at the sky, in this instance, it doesn't burn out because there's so much fog there. It's quite dark, but everything now becomes an interesting silhouette. All the confusing detail gets lost in the silhouettes. But it is quite a chaotic shot. The forest, you really get the sense of this primeval landscape and the forest shot, tangled forest everywhere. But then we have this really quite strong composition of this tree fern here in strong silhouette that was shooting out into the main composition to grab your attention, to actually form the main photographic subject of the picture, and everything else kind of just sits there in the background to set the scene. This is the tree fern that really takes your attention. And everything else is really quite strongly muted because of the fog, which is really quite a nice atmospheric situation to be in. Coming back to sunlight and also back to English countryside, taken photograph very early in the morning, just a few minutes after sunrise, when we still have a lot of dew on the grass and mist floating in the trees. Again, another example of backlighting. So we have this oak tree here out in the middle of the field, and picture is obviously not just about the tree, but about its shadow as well. So we have this enormous, beautiful subject here, which really gives us and its golden light gives us a wonderful sort of atmosphere and moods to the country scene, with the sheep forming a nice sort of secondary focus as well. And with it being backlit, they have this really nice sort of halo of light around them, which really looks quite, I think, really a beautiful scene. In terms of composition, you could argue, I think, that the tree should be further off to the right, so it's off center. But then the problem then I have is that this group of sheep on the right are much too close to the edge of the picture. They're already a bit too close to the bottom of the frame, and I didn't really want to have it any closer to the edge. And I seem to remember also off the left of the frame there were other distracting elements, so I had to frame the picture in this way to have the subject more or less in the center. But nevertheless, it's still, although it's pretty sensual, it's still making a really nice composition, very atmospheric and moody. Now, one final tree picture. This is this kind of strong silhouette of a tree with a double starburst of the sun breaking past the tree's main trunk on either side of the trunk. Makes it a very strong atmospheric shot. It's a monkey puzzle tree taken in Argentina in its wild habitat on the edge, in the foothills of the Andes in Patagonia. And this kind of shot is taken very much as is the border really between landscape photography and nature or plant photography. So you can take your pick as to which it is, but it's right at that sort of borderline between where landscape photography starts to mutate into plant photography. But I thought I'd show you this as sort of this really strong silhouette kind of photography that you can do with landscapes or with plants in the landscape. Now, anyway, no talk by me about landscape photography would be complete without waterfalls. As anybody who's gone out photographing with me will know, waterfalls figure quite large in my landscape photography. So a few shots on waterfalls. As some of you will know, when I photograph waterfall, I like to have it in flat light, so I don't have sunlight going on that water, because the sunlight will tend to make all this white water here and here burn out, and it doesn't look good. So flat lights actually enable me to put the camera on a tripod as well and use a slow shutter speed, so I blur out the moving water to really give us a strong sense of movement. This is actually 0.4 of a second. It's f/22, so it's giving me a big depth of field, so everything right from the rocks in front all the way through to the waterfall itself in the background is sharp, so I've got a big depth of field. And in terms of the composition, then your eye is led by the stream in the bottom right up through here. This rock here is a secondary element which helps to catch your eye and then push you on towards the waterfall. At least that's how I hope it works in a way. This obviously is not too strong an element, but it's strong enough to actually pick your eye up along the way and lead you on towards the waterfall. When I photograph waterfalls, I always do it in such a way that I start with quite a number of wide angles from different wide angle views from different positions, and then I'll start doing telephoto details. And I wanted you to concentrate just on this little area here, which is the subject of the next shot, which is this detail shot with a telephoto lens, not standing in the same position. I moved in much closer. So this is a much simpler shot in many ways in terms of composition. It's very minimalist, just a couple of rocks with the water crashing down onto the rocks. Shutter speed is 1/8 of a second, so it's really the water's moving very fast, and you get these beautiful what I call shards of glass bouncing off the rocks, and very much a monochromatic picture, although it's shot in color. Just the rocks are almost black, and there's an enormous amount of white water around. So there's always a great deal of danger of the white water burning out, which is another reason for making sure that you're photographing this in flat lights, so you don't have all this burning out. Compositionally, we've got these two peaks here which work reasonably well. This area in the bottom left is a little bit of a distraction, but I could not get myself in a position where I could get this composition on these two rocks without that in the shot. So I kind of just decided to live with that and just use that as accept that as being an essential part, an inevitable part of having these two rocks in the shot with the water crashing down on them. There are occasions, however, when you can't really use that slow shutter speed method, and you end up having to use a fast shutter speed simply because there's just way too much light. And again, when you're a long way from home, you don't have the luxury of being able to sit around and wait for what you would like to have as what you consider to be the best lighting conditions. So this is the mighty Gullfoss in Iceland, taken on quite a moderately sunny day, looking more or less straight into the light. So the light is bouncing off the water of the waterfall here, which is creating a few problems. But what it is really doing beneficially is shining through all this spray. So it's really picking up the spray beautifully, and that's really making the atmosphere of this shot. Without the spray, I don't think it would be a particularly exciting picture, other than the fact that it'd be a great record of this incredible waterfall. I use an ND grad filter to darken the sky at the top because it really was very, very bright. So that's worked reasonably well. And then if we go on to a next shot, to a more detailed shot of the same waterfall, then I'm really homing in on just the water as it cascades over the top of the waterfall, and just catching the sunlight, using a fast shutter speed to really freeze the movement of the water, to get these catch the water droplets up in the air. This is 1,000th of a second at f/8. So really a very fast shutter speed. You always know that when the water's going over a waterfall, it is going at a heck of a speed, much faster than you think. So you've got to use a very fast shutter speed to catch that water and really freeze those droplets in the air. And I love the background, this wall of spray in the background. It's not completely taken out all the details, so you can just see bits of the cliff here and there, which will give you an idea of the background. But clearly your main area of interest is going to be the water here pouring over the lip of the waterfall and just being frozen in midair. So that's for me, a relatively unusual thing for me to shoot waterfall with fast shutter speed and freeze the movement of the water. But this is the sort of thing you can do when you've got lots of sunlight and you can use a fast shutter speed to do that. And finally, for the last couple of pictures, I'm going to just introduce panoramics a little bit. They're quite popular these days. And obviously the first and easiest way in which you can do a panoramic is to just take a standard 35mm shot and just chop it. And which you can do if you've got a lot of empty space not doing very much, is what happened in this shot. Had a lot of empty, not very interesting water at the bottom of the picture, so I just cut off a lot of the water. I probably could actually remove some more and just have this panoramic shot of this glacier. This is a Speghettini Glacier in Argentina. The lighting is a little bit awkward because it's coming in sort of from above all this cloud and fog. Is shining straight down onto the glacier, so shooting into the light is a little bit awkward, but it's quite a dramatic shot, partly as a result. Got probably some burnout here. I wasn't really in control of the situation because I was on a boat filled with other visitors, so I was kind of just at the mercy of the boat's skipper, really, which is fine. But I was able to use my elbows to get everybody else out of the way until I could get a clear shot, which is quite an achievement. But not really in a position to control where I could actually get the lighting angle right. But I'm not sure that I could have it on this particular occasion. Anyway, panoramics. Although you might occasionally crop a 35mm picture into panoramic format, the usual way to shoot a panoramic, of course, is to take a whole series of pictures and then stitch them together in Photoshop afterwards. And this is just an example of one shot taken on the north coast of Devon, 9 images put together, shooting vertically. I think this would actually be, to do this in detail, we would do a whole evening talk just on panoramics, but basically shooting vertically with the autofocus turned off and shooting in manually, so you got the same exposure all the way across, just sort of initially get the right exposure or the best exposure using sort of the middle of the view, and then just take a sequence of shots, keeping your camera absolutely level all the way, and then until you got a set of pictures. If you shoot in RAW, then process will give all those pictures the same settings, same exposure settings, so they all have the same exposure all the way through, hopefully, and then you can put them in Photoshop and merge them together. Using as JPEGs or TIFFs, probably JPEG, in order to save the processing power of your computer. What hopefully you'll end up with, what you'll end up with is something like this. This coastal scene of taken it in Hartland, near Hartland Quay. This is kind of the simple technique, really, you might say, rather than the absolutely technically correct technique, which I'm not going to go into right now. But just really holding the camera vertically and just shooting a series of pictures as you go across. Actually, what I will do is just go back to that previous picture. What you will see is a lot of overlap between each of the pictures. So the software has a lot of stuff it can grab hold of to actually know how to line the pictures up in sequence. And don't have your lens too wide, no wider than about 40mm. Otherwise, you end up with distortion at the edges of the pictures, and then it won't stitch together properly. So then if you do all that, then you end up with hopefully a picture that looks like that. And then just a couple more panoramics. One taken in the Philippines at dusk, obviously in this instance with the camera on a tripod rather than handheld. So again, you've got to have it, make absolutely certain that the tripod is completely level, so that when you rotate the camera on top of the tripod, everything stays level, and you don't have to end up with any crooked horizons, which you have to correct before you can then merge the pictures together. Or a shot like this of Mount Mayon, Philippines' most active volcano. This kind of structure really lends itself to panoramic shots. This is, I'm not sure how many pictures this was. I think it was about a dozen pictures stitched together to make this panoramic, taken in evening sunlight shortly before sunset. And then finally, the final shot is a panoramic of Naples with Vesuvius over on the right there, taken quite early in the morning. You see that the sky over Vesuvius is burning out rather badly. That's often the problem with panoramics. If you rotate the camera around to the point where you're starting to get to the sun, or the area of the sky where the sun is, it's difficult to actually get the exposure right and balance it across the whole picture. And you can see this picture is actually quite tightly framed as well between this rather dark conifer and then these houses over here. But you end up with a superb urban landscape of Naples. So that's really my whistle-stop tour of panoramics, and also really of landscape photography. You know, just finally, then the usual sort of thing about summary about the website, nigelhicks.com, where you go for the photography courses, etc., and the books about the Southwest, where you can buy them there. the one thing, the one new thing to say about the books is that there's now reviews available on the website. So if any of you who's bought any of my books anywhere, any of these books anywhere, whether you bought them from me or bought them from Amazon or from Waterstones or anywhere, then it'd be great if you want to go onto the website to actually write a review. You would just go to the nigelhicks.com and go to the shop and find then the relevant page for the book or books, and then click on buy here. You wouldn't actually have to buy anything. You would just go to the books page where you see not only the buying process but also the reviews, and you can write a review there. So anyway, talks. The next talk will be the 27th of January. So that'll be our next talk. Where we'll be talking about focus and what I often call the third critical component of successful photography. I've talked about light. I talked about composition as critical components. The third element of that triumvirate of critical components really is focus, getting your focusing right. And that's not just really about getting the subject sharp, it's about lots of other things as well. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we'll have a short Q&A, as once again, I've gone on a little bit too long as I did with the last talk as well. So we're running a little bit short of time for questions and answers, but I'll stop sharing. If you'd like to switch your camera and microphone on, if you want to ask any questions, that would be great. So, yes, Mike, yeah.
Yeah, hi, yeah. Quick question about the ND grad filters.
Yeah.
We just wanted to use it for a very small section at the top of the frame. Could you end up with a line where, if you like, at the bottom of the filter hits, is it in frame?
I know.
Does it appear as a line, or can that be?
Generally speaking, if you're using the right size rectangular filter, that won't be a problem. There are different sizes of filters, and if you're using a filter that's too small for your lens, then yes, that can be an issue. But if you've bought the right size for your lenses, then no, that won't happen. Yeah, but that's a good point.
I take it the right size ones are expensive.
Not necessarily. If you buy Lee, yes, but not if you buy Kokin or something like that. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Nigel, what use do you make of polarizing filters?
Polarizers, yes. Since I switched to digital, I've hardly used a polarizer ever, because most of the things that we used to use polarizers for enhancing contrast and saturation and so on, you can do in seconds in the computer anyway. The one thing you can use a polarizer for, which you can't do in computer, is to remove reflections of, say, wet vegetation or windows or water surfaces and so on. So polarizer is still quite good for that, but I hardly ever use a polarizer even for that. But because the problem with a polarizer is you do lose 2 stops of light, so you reduce your light by 4-fold. So I tend to sort of don't really want to sacrifice all that light very often for the composition, for the photo. If that makes sense. Anybody else?
You get different strength grad filters.
Yes, sorry, I didn't mention that. You can get the filters in different strengths, not just in soft and hard, but actually some manufacturers have sort of several different degrees of hardness as well now. So but yes, you can get them in different strengths as well. So to reduce the light by sort of 1 stop, which is a halving, or 2 stops, which is a 4-fold reduction, or 3 stops, which is an 8-fold reduction in the amount of light going through the dark area. So those are the most usual sort of strengths of filter. Yeah.
And if you're only buying a couple, which ones would you go for?
Yeah, my sort of workhorse, the one I use sort of 90% of the time, is the 2-stop. So it's what's often called 0.6. Yeah. So that's kind of the good middle of the road one. Anybody else with a question?
You use f22 quite a lot. I was always told that if you go above f16, you would lose some sharpness. And that doesn't seem to be the case in your photos, for sure.
Yes, I struggle a little bit with this one because I don't see it, but then I use Canon's L-series lenses. So I suspect to some extent it depends on the quality of your lens. I can imagine if you're using sort of the more the cheaper lenses, then you're more likely to get that problem of diffraction, which is what causes loss of quality at the narrower lens apertures. Certainly, I do get it on one of my lenses if I go beyond beyond f22, if I go to f27 or something like that, then the image quality does markedly start to deteriorate. But up to f22, it seems to be fine on my lenses. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Actually, Nigel, I'd just like to say thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Right.
I wish you a good Christmas and New Year.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, and you too. And I really hope to be able to see all of you in the flesh next year. The first course starts on the 21st of March, the schedule for. So you'll definitely all be signing up for that one, I hope. It's a low light course. So actually the next talk, I say on the 27th of January, is about focus. The one after that, 24th of February, will be about low light photography. So a lot of the pictures you saw today were taken in low light, so it sort of links in with that, sort of shooting at dusk and dawn, and also night photography as well. So yeah. So thank you very much for that, for the Christmas wishes, etc. Anybody else?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Oh, thank you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And also, finally, a thank you, not just Christmas wishes, but also thank you to those people like Ian, for example, who've already written reviews of the books they bought from me, and it's helping make the website actually look like a real shop, which is great. So thank you very much. If anybody else wants to write reviews of any books of mine, please feel free to do so. Those are nice reviews, of course. Anybody else? Otherwise, before Zoom cuts us off, I'll end the talk. Sorry to rush things a little bit, but as usual, I talked way too much, as I always do. Thank you very much for joining me, and so I'll close the talk here. And everybody have a wonderful Christmas. Thank you very much for coming along this evening.
Thank you.
Bye. 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 Bye.